Morning. I'm going to get started slowly here. So yesterday, if you recall, I'm sorry, today's daf in the Second Avodah Zarah is daf Samach 60. We're up to 2 weeks away from, almost 2 weeks away from finishing the Masechta. And the discussion yesterday and days before as well was what happens when a non-Jew, an Ovei Kochavim, there's been debate, a lot of debate in the halacha, not so much in the Gemara, about what about a Jew, a non-Jew who's not an Ovei Kochavim, right? What if someone is, according to the Rambam, a Muslim, or so they don't worship idols, or secular, let's say, whatever that means. Where do they fall into this whole category? Our Gemara has not dealt with that very explicitly. We have dealt with it obliquely because we've talked about what if it's ein derech nisuch b'kach, which we're going to have today, or if they're doing something else.
Something with the Zoom system is not working. It's the Hebrew Institute. I don't know what.
Can you hear me, Ken?
This thing's not working. It's the whole thing. It goes on and off.
Do you hear me or you don't hear me?
This guy's frozen.
That might be your internet connection.
I don't know what's going on with this. I don't know what's going on.
Can you hear me now, Ken?
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, I do now. The system, the connection was down.
Okay, well, let's hopefully you can hear me now. So today's daf, I'm going to start from the beginning, is daf Samach 60 in Avodah Zarah. And as I was mentioning, we've been having several variables in terms of a non-Jew touching nisuch. Nisuch means to pour out libations of a wine. We had a concept called kirkush, which was shaking something, where we thought that motion might be a motion of nisuch, even though you don't clearly see them pouring it. There was a concept of touching, or not touching directly, but touching through something else by holding an object that touched the wine. Remember, we had a reed before, or a lulav. And then all these kind of different cases. And then there's, of course, questions where the guy has machshava, or where the guy is distracted, so he's working, or he's trying to do something else. Anyways, a lot of these kind of cases. So we had one very interesting one yesterday, where a non-Jew put his hand into a barrel to capture an esrog. And we said, hold the hand so that it doesn't move it, and pour the wine out. And because, although he touched it, he didn't touch it with kavanah, because he was going in to get the etrog, and he didn't pull his hand out, which we would have been worried about, which would have been kirkush. So then the wine is mutar b'hana'ah. Today's case is a little bit different. Says the Gemara, we are on Daf Samach Amid Aleph. Where am I? 6 lines from the top, the last one on the line. Amar Rav Papa. Says Rav Papa, you had a common scenario back in those days where you were pouring wine, you were transferring wine from a big barrel, which is the danna, into a small container, into a wine bottle or to a pitcher. So let's say the Amar Rav Papa Goy Adana, you have a non-Jew, not Goy, Ovei Kochavim Adana, who's holding the barrel, and Yisrael Akuva, and Yisrael is holding the pitcher, and then the Ovei Kochavim pours into the pitcher, so Chamra Asir, so then the wine becomes Asir, because my time, because the actual push of the barrel, the turn of the barrel, is from a non-Jew, and therefore he could have had thoughts for nisuch, and it would be prohibited. But if it's the opposite, let's say Yisrael Adana, the Yisrael is the one holding the barrel, and the Ovei Kochavim Akuva, and the Ovei Kochavim is one holding the pitcher, then Chamra Shari. Then the Chamra would be mutter, because Ovei Kochavim, although he's holding the pitcher, he's like stabilizing the pitcher. He's not actually holding it. He's sort of just preventing it from moving. And so he's not actually doing anything. He's just standing there doing his job, right? Now, of course, we've seen cases before where even if he's doing nothing, it is a problem. But here he's working essentially, and he's doing his job. He's being watched. He's being observed by the Jew, and therefore it would be permitted. But if he moves the pitcher side to side, then asir. If he's actually moving the pitcher as the wine comes in to get it more distributed or to make sure it doesn't fall, then it would be asir because he's actually moving the wine. Says Rav Papa, the next case, I'm Rav Papa, Hi Ovei Kochavim Didari Zika. Let's say you have an Ovei Kochavim. Remember we had these zikot before, which were the Romans would travel around with, and everyone, of course, these are wineskins that you would carry around and you'd have wine in them. So if a non-Jew is carrying a wineskin, the Ka'azza Yisrael Achure, and now Yisrael is going behind him. I'm not clear exactly, why the Yisrael is going behind him. Presumably, it seems very likely that he is somehow watching him and preventing him from touching the wine. So Rashi says, right? He sees that the non-Jew doesn't actually touch the wine itself, but he's holding on to the wineskin. So says the Rav Papa, Malya, if the wineskin is full, meaning the wine is filled to the brim, then sharei. Then in fact, it's permitted to drink that wine. Why is it permitted? Because the non-Jew didn't touch it, and he didn't lo mikarkesh. He didn't move the wine around because there's no space, right? The wineskin is complete. It's 100% saturated, full. And so moving it doesn't actually move the wine. So, but if it's chasera, but if it's missing, meaning it's half full or 3/4 full, then it would be asir, because dilma mikarkesh, maybe the non-Jew, when he was carrying it, was moving it around, and his intention was, I'm moving this around in order to worship my God, and therefore it became Avodah Zarah. But kuba, when you talk about a kuba now, kuba again is the pitcher, right? So a container that's open. So then it's the exact opposite. Malya, again, if a non-Jew is carrying a pitcher and a Jew is behind him, making sure he doesn't touch it, but still if it's full, it's asir. Because even though you're trying to make sure he doesn't touch it, it's full to the top. And the chance of him putting his hand at the lip and touching the wine and doing it with intention to be minasech is high. So Dilma Nagad, maybe he touched the wine. But chasera, if the pitcher is half full, then it's shari. And it's permitted Dilo Naga. It's permitted because he didn't touch the wine, because it's not to the top. He didn't stick his hand in to touch it, and it's permitted. Now, of course, the problem is that you would ask, the Rashi anticipates, what about the fact that he's shaking the bottle? Right? Any movement we say caused by a non-Jew could be movement for nisuch. And so the fact that the non-Jew is walking with this open pitcher should be a problem of kirkush, as we called it. So Rashi explains, morning Miriam, Rashi explains that in this case, you wouldn't worry about kirkush. And this is a very, very important detail. So again, the case is you have a non-Jew carrying a container, and a Jew is standing behind him, being mashkiach on top of him to make sure he's not touching it, right? So there we said, if the container is a closed container and it's full to the brim, it would be permitted. Because since the non-Jew can't touch it, and we have a mashkiach making sure he doesn't open it up and touch it, and when he carries it, none of the wine sloshes around, because, this is in their view, the thing is full. There's nowhere for the wine to go. There's no airspace. And so there's no kishkush. But if it's a half full container, there's kishkush and it'll be prohibited. But if it's an open container, he's carrying a pitcher with the open top, then if it's full to the top, we worry the non-Jew touched it because it's at the top. If it's not full to the top, we don't worry, and it's permitted. And it's permitted for two reasons. First of all, he didn't touch it because he didn't, the Jew was watching him. He didn't stick his hand in. What about the fact that he sloshed it around, that there's kirkush? So Rashi explains that in this case, kirkush is undesirable, because since it's an open pitcher, the more it sloshes around, the more likely it is to spill out, right? And you don't want the wine to spill. And so therefore you assume that any kirkush that happened was undesirable. The non-Jew's job is hold this thing as steady as possible, and whatever variation happens was not his desire, and therefore it's not yayin nisach. And so that would not be a problem. Says the Gemara, though, Rav Ashi, we are in the short daf, now 8 lines from the bottom. Rav Ashi said, well, look, if you got a zika, if you have a closed wineskin, right, and a non-Jew is carrying it, bein malye ubein chaser shari. It'll be permitted whether it's full or it's half full, or it's partially empty, right? Now everyone agreed before that if it's full, it's permitted. Why would it be permitted if it was empty, half empty? Meaning, why can't you say he's shaking the wineskin, and in shaking it, he wants to move the wine in order to worship his idol? Says Rav Ashi, an incredibly important yesod, my taima, ein derech nisuch b'kach. This is not the way you worship a god, right? Meaning, you pour libations in front of Avodah Zarah. Remember, we had our opinion yesterday, which we didn't go with, that nisuch yayin is only in front of an idol, right? If there's no idol in front of you, then there's no problem. No, we didn't paskin that way. But this is essentially an extension of that we do paskin like, that there are circumstances in which it's ein derech nisuch. It's not the way, if you're carrying a closed container of wine on your shoulder, that you're thinking, I'm going to pour this, I'm moving it around in order to worship my God. And because of that, we don't worry. Now, of course, you can take this very far, and poskim do find very creative ways to say that a certain action is considered derech nisach or not derech nisach. Clearly our Gemara doesn't apply it everywhere, but it's an important yesod of Rav Ashi that, in fact, is halacha. Now, the next case was, we are again 7 lines from the bottom, ma'atzra Zarah, right? So ma'atzra Zarah is some kind of press. Remember, we talked last week about different kind of presses. So there were presses that you would step on, of course, but this is a press which is used with beams. So you put wood, instead of people standing on the grapes, you put all the grapes in the vat, and you put these wooden beams on top of it that you would then push down with weights or with pressure. So here you have a vat, basically, a wine press, where the pressure put on the grapes is through wood, not through stepping. You're not touching them. So in that case, let's say a non-Jew was the one who pressed down the beams. If Papi said it's mutter, Papi said shari, and Rav Ashi, Vitamer of Simi Bar Ashi, said asur. That still the non-Jew is putting pressure on the beams that are going on the wine, and therefore it's asur. Now says the Gemara, let's clarify. B'kocho, if the Ovei Kochavim is using his force to push down these beams to crush the grapes, everyone agrees that that is asur, not necessarily asur b'hana'ah, but certainly asur b'shtiyah. And again, this is a debate we had before about how much it's asur. It was actually a machloket, right? But anyway, everyone agrees that it is asur. Ki pligi, when do they argue? When do Rav Papi or Rav Simi Bar Ashi argue? B'koach kochov. He's doing it indirectly. Right? Let's say the non-Jew is pushing on a device that pushes on the device that pushes on the grapes, right? So he's not directly pushing on the wood that goes on the grapes. So there, that's a machloket. Is that considered to be his energy and it's usher, or it's too far removed and it's permitted? The Ikadam, some had a different version of this, and they said, 3 lines in the bottom, Bekoach kocho, if it's indirect energy from the non-Jew, then kuli amalo pligi da asir. Everyone agrees, I read it the wrong way. Lo kuli amalo pligi da shari. Everyone agrees that it's permitted. In fact, the machloket between the Amoraim was about direct, indirect force, meaning the guy is not standing on the grapes, he's standing on the piece of wood, or he's pushing down the piece of wood that is going on the grapes. And that was a machloket Amoraim. Now, in fact, there was a story where there was a non-Jew who pushed the grapes down indirectly. So koach kocho means his energy went to other energy, which pushed him down. And also Rabbi Yaakov ben Harpakud, and Rabbi Yaakov ben Harpakud said it's prohibited. So again, you see here that he paskin probably like the first language that the machloket is b'koach kocho, and he's going like the chumrah of Rav Ashi or of Simi Bar Ashi, that it's prohibited. The last 2 words on Daf Samech Amud Aleph is that Ahi Chavita. It's a very interesting story. You had a barrel.
We learned earlier about 4 or 5 days ago that if there was koach, not koach koko, but koach, and he didn't know it was wine, it would be permitted.
Correct. So, like I said,
he must know that there's wine here, then, right?
Yeah, well, this is a press, you're a wine press, but yeah, so this is more obvious that it's wine, but there are many opinions, right? So remember, we had even earlier in the week, as you call many Tanaim and Amoraim, we're going to have more of them today, that touching is not so simple, right? There are times where someone touches something and they know it's wine, as you said. Sometimes they don't know. Sometimes they're very clearly doing it, even if they know it's wine, for a different purpose, right? And so their function, we call Torah b'mlachto, is the language we had earlier. They're focused on their work. They're not focused on worshiping idols, right? So if there's a real function, that may change the halakha. A lot of these were machloketim. Anyways, the case here is hahu chavita. You have a barrel, okay? You're sitting around this, again, you could set the scene here, turn the page to Daf Samech Amud Bet. There's a barrel, a group of 5 people, whatever, 10 people are sitting around, ready to drink this big barrel, and all of a sudden it develops a crack. Ifka'ata, it got a crack. And you could just see it going in slow motion, right? The wooden barrel is starting to crack. It's going to split apart. The wine's going to pour out everywhere. It hasn't poured out yet. And it's split lo orka, for the length of the barrel, so the height, up and down of the barrel. So when this thing actually splits apart, this is disaster, right? The whole thing is falling apart. So a very friendly non-Jew, Idri, remember Idri is always the language, they jumped up. Idri ahu aveku chavim, and chavka, he hugged the barrel, right? To put it back together. He gave it a bear hug to keep it together until they can move the contents or, fix it. So that was very kind of him. The problem, of course, was that in hugging the barrel, he was essentially supporting the wine, right? He's keeping it together. So the question was, can they drink the wine from this barrel? So Sharia Rav from Bar Papa. So Rav from Bar Papa said it's permitted, and he tamer of Huna Braid of Yeshua, Lizvune Lovdei Kochavim. They allow them not to drink it because the non-Jew touched it. No, he didn't touch it directly, but he touched it indirectly by holding onto the barrel. But he didn't, well, we'll see why, but you're allowed to sell it, Lovdei Kochavim, so it's prohibited to drink, but not prohibited b'hana'ah. Now says again, it's not so clear why exactly it would be permitted. Rashi says here that because there was no shichshuk. He didn't actually move the wine, right? Because nothing moved. He actually held it still. And so since he didn't actually move it, it was just touching it, and touching it through intermediary, according to Rashi here, only makes it prohibited to drink and not prohibited b'hana'ah. It's only when he shakes it and you're worried maybe he's actually doing nisuch that it will be prohibited also to drink. Not so clear, but that's what Rashi says. It says the Gemara though in the fourth
Rashi doesn't say the word asur l'shtot though.
Gemara says
Assuming it. Rashi
Gemara.
doesn't. The Gemara doesn't say that either.
The Gemara says
It
that
said it's permitted to sell it.
right,
Doesn't say it's forbidden
correct,
to drink.
correct. But
You're assuming that.
that is the implication, correct. But Hani Mili says the Gemara did pak'a la'arka. That's only if it cracks up and down the length of the barrel. Aval liputia, if it cracks on the horizontal side, right?
Width.
Across
That's
it.
width.
Width, thank you.
Width.
Then afilu b'shtiyashari, right? So there, meaning the barrel starts, there develops a crack midway. The barrel's standing up, and there's a crack in the middle, and the non-Jew sits on top of it or pushes down on top so that it doesn't separate. That itself would even be mutter to drink because my taima ma'aseh leveina ka'avid. Basically, all the non-Jew is doing, he's like putting a brick on top to keep it together. He's not actually holding it together in a way that requires his own energy or his own input, and therefore that is considered to be an insignificant action, and the wine itself is not affected by the action of the non-Jew, and it would be permitted to drink. So that's the halacha there. Now, the final case before our Mishnah is Ahu Ovei Kochavim. There was a non-Jew. They came one morning to the wine press and they found hanging out there was an Oved Avodah Zarah. They're like, what are you doing here? This wine press has been kashered. Now there's no necessarily wine in it, but there might be dregs and little liquid from yesterday's work. So Amar Rav Ashi said, well, it depends on how much liquid is in the wine press. If there's enough moisture that it can make other things wet, right? Sometimes you have a sheen of moisture, but you touch it and it doesn't spread that moisture. But if it's wet enough that if you put a coat on it or a napkin, it will soak it up, then you have to assume that he might have worshipped with that moisture, and there's yain nesach in this press, and you have to clean out the press. We're going to talk later, actually, we have a whole Gemara later in a couple of weeks at the end of the Masechta about how you clean out things that are yain nesach, right? How you do kashering for, not for Pesach, but for yain nesach. And you have to do boy hadacha. You have to, hadacha means you rinse it off. Boy niguv, and niguv means literally you dry it or you clean it. Anyways, it's a second step. The Gemara later will talk about these steps we got to do. But that's only if there's enough moisture there that it makes other things wet. But elo, if there isn't, then then it's considered just to be, not really yain nesach, and you just wipe off the area, and you would be allowed to use the wine press. Anyways, this is a preview of what we're going to have actually in a couple of weeks about how you clean out things that are concerned used by a non-Jew. Now it says the Mishnah, Ovei kochavim shenimtza omed b'tzad habor shel yain. This is a case, maybe we brought it because we just brought this case. Maybe we brought the case before because of this Mishnah. You come in one morning, there's a vat of wine, and a non-Jew is standing next to it. He's not touching it. He's not there, but this seems very suspicious, right? The question is, did the non-Jew touch the wine? And so says the Mishnah, it depends. Usually you would assume that a non-Jew is not going to touch your wine because if you catch him in the act, you can sue him. We learned yesterday, you can make him pay, right, for turning your wine into yain nesach. So if he touches your wine and you catch him in the act, you'll have to pay $10,000. So you assume he's not going to touch it if you don't see it. But it depends. Im yesh lo milve alav asur. If the non-Jew has a loan for you on this wine, we'll see in the Gemara that means that you borrowed money from him to make this wine, and in theory, he could just take the wine and not pay you back and not let you pay him back, meaning not collect his debt. So there, he may not be worried about touching it because he can always say if he's caught, okay, I'll just keep the wine, right? So then it's asur because you have to assume that the non-Jew might have touched the wine and turned it into yain nesach. But ein lo milve alav, if he doesn't have any loan related to this wine, then it's mutar because you assume he didn't touch it, unless you of course see that he touched it. And we're going to get into the details a little bit about how, it obviously has to be a case where the Jew has access so that the non-Jew won't touch it because he's afraid the Jew's going to walk in at any time and find it. Now the next case in the Mishnah is nafal bar, which was a tragic thing that happened, right? A non-Jew falls into the pit. Now we're going to see in the Gemara a discussion about whether he comes out of it alive or dead. Right? Because that, of course, was very tragic work accident that if you drowned in the vat, you might have died, right? It's hard to swim and it's whatever. So a non-Jew, an Oved Avodah Kochavim, falls into the pit full of wine. Allah, and he's raised from the pit. Again, the Gemara will discuss whether he's raised dead or raised alive. So that's one case. Madado b'kaneh. A second case is, let's say a non-Jew is there measuring with a pole in order to see how much wine there is, right? How high it is maybe, or something like that, right? And so he puts the stick, the kaneh, into the wine, but he doesn't touch the wine. So these are all, well, the first case he actually touched it because he fell into it, but he clearly was not thinking about worshiping his God. He was thinking about learning how to swim, right? So meaning these are all cases of distraction, basically. Or he tis et tzirah b'kaneh. Let's say there's a tzirah, there's a bee, right, in the press, and he wants to get the bee away from the wine, and he hits the bee with the stick, and he hits the wine while he's doing that. So again, his intention was clearly not to touch the wine; it was to get rid of the bee. Or let's say you have a barrel that's mirutacha. Mirutacha means literally boiling, but it means it's getting foam on top. It's heating up. Like when things sort of ferment too much, they get foam on top of them, and he's trying to scoop it off, right? So he's removing the foam from the top of the barrel. Again, his intention is not to touch the wine; it's to get rid of the stuff on top. In all of these, we had stories where this actually happened. Vamru, and the rabbi said, Yimacher, that wine is prohibited to drink, because a non-Jew actually touched it or touched it indirectly, but because he didn't seem to touch it with intention to do nisuch, it is permitted to sell. So it's mutar b'hana'ah and asur b'shti'ah. And Rabbi Shimon matir. Rabbi Shimon says, no big deal. If the non-Jew was not intending to do nisuch, you can even drink the wine. Okay, now we'll see this in the Gemara. We had Rabbi Shimon before. The final case in the Mishnah is natal techavit v'zarka b'chamato lebar. Let's say a non-Jew is angry, he comes in, they're having some dispute, and he takes a barrel, chavit, and he throws it into the vat that's full of wine, right? So and this is very similar, we would think, to the case before, where we had a non-Jew pouring water into the wine, right? Where he didn't actually touch the wine, but he poured something into it. So before, you recall, we said it's prohibited because we're afraid that if we let the non-Jew pour water into your wine, he's going to get too close to the wine. He's going to actually touch your wine and cause yain nesach. But in this case, this actually happened. And they said it's not a problem. You're allowed to drink the wine, and we'll see in the Gemara that it's because he was in anger. So he wasn't intending to, put something into the wine. He was just acting out of anger, and therefore his action is not thought to be intentional for yain nesach. Now says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says, remember, our Mishnah said that if you walk into the vat one morning and the guy is standing there next to the thing, it's if he has a milveh on you, you owe him $1,000, then you assume he might have touched the wine, and it's yain nesach. Says Shmuel, that doesn't mean that you owe him $1,000. The Jew owes the non-Jew $1,000. It means it means that you owe him money for that wine, meaning you borrowed $1,000 from him, and the guarantor for that money is this wine. So then, if he wants to, he can take the wine, because he says, basically, it's my wine, right? You haven't paid me the money. This is my wine, and therefore you think he'll be much more lenient with this. And that's why you're afraid he's going to touch it. But if you just owe him $1,000, not this wine, you don't have to worry about that. Amar Ravashi, it says Ravashi, Matnita Nami Deka. Like it implies in our Mishnah, not this Mishnah, but the next Mishnah tomorrow, this statement of Shmuel. It's not, because the next Mishnah we're going to have tomorrow morning says the following. A person is mittaher, he's purifying, which means he's koshering the wine of a non-Jew. Now, how do you kosher the wine of a non-Jew? Meaning, a non-Jew, is the case we're going to have tomorrow, has a vat, and he says, look, I want to make wine that Jews will drink. So he hires a Jew to run whatever you call it, a run of his wine, right? Which they do all the time nowadays, right? It's how you make wine. So the Jewish person comes and says, I'm going to take the grapes and I'll crush them and I'll make the wine, and I'll have a hashgacha. I'll put an OU on it that it's kosher wine. So the Mishnah says, let's say the Jew is being mitaher yeno shel nachri, but when he's done, he makes the wine, he takes the barrels, and he leaves it in the non-Jew's house, in his storehouse. V'hala kotevlo, and the non-Jew writes to the Jew. Remember, the deal is going to be, again, we'll see this tomorrow. Now, let's say the Jew says, I'll keep half the wine or something. I'll run the press. I'll put my stamp on it. We'll sell it to Jews for a lot of money. I'll keep half the profit, right? So they store the wine with the non-Jew, and the non-Jew writes a receipt to the Jew. Halak kotevlo hitkabalti mimcha ma'ot. You paid me back my money. Now the truth is he didn't pay him yet, but he wrote to him, "I'm not going to come claim to you for the money." Then mutar. Then if the wine is left among the non-Jew, it's mutar. And the reason we're going to see in a second is because we're not afraid the non-Jew is going to touch it. Because if the non-Jew comes and touches it, the Jew will say to him, "You ruined the wine. You got to pay me." And the fact that I owe you money is not a problem because you already wrote me a receipt saying that I paid you back the money I owed you. Aval, continues the Mishnah, this is again tomorrow's Mishnah, Im yirtzeh Yisrael lahotzi. If the Jew wants to leave, meaning he wants to take the wine out, and he says, "I finished making this barrel, I want to come store it in my storehouse." Ve'ein minicho ad sheyitin lo ma'otav. The non-Jew says, "No, you can't take the barrel out until you pay me," right? Then, and he walks away and he leaves the barrel in the non-Jewish warehouse, the warehouse owned by a non-Jew. This happened in Beit Shan, and they came back and said the Jew can't touch the wine because the fact that he walked away and the wine is in the property of the non-Jew and he owes the non-Jew money for this wine, we are afraid that the non-Jew touched the wine. So what you see from there is that taima de'ein minicho. The reason is that the non-Jew does not allow him to leave, meaning he still owes money on this wine. Ha-minicho shari. If the non-Jew had said to the Jew, "You can take the wine out," right? Meaning, I'm not demanding payment from this actual wine, but I'm still demanding payment, so you owe me $1,000, then it would be permitted because we would assume that the non-Jew is not going to touch the wine. Shema mina, you see from here what Shmuel said, which is milva al oto yayin be'inan shema mina. That the only time it's prohibited and that you worry that the non-Jew will actually touch the wine is if he owns money on that barrel. So basically, in his mind, it's as if it's his barrel. And so he's not embarrassed or worried about touching it. And you're going to come and say, "Oh, you ruined my barrel." Say, "It's my barrel," if you catch him. But otherwise, even if the Jew owes the non-Jew money, we don't assume the non-Jew is going to touch it because he's afraid of getting caught. And if he gets caught, he'll lose his money. So again, the afraid of getting caught is very important. It has to be a situation where the Jew could come in and catch it. So that's the first case of the Mishnah. The next case was Nafal lebar v'oleh. A non-Jew, a goy, falls into the pit, into the vat, and he's brought out. We said the wine is asur to drink, but mutar b'hanam.
Wouldn't it make a difference where they live? We had cases in a previous Gemara. If it's in a non-Jewish country, the non-Jew can summon his legions to help him. Whereas a Jewish country, Jewish rule is a difference. So even if they owed money, the non-Jew could say, "Listen, I've got my court and my judges and so forth, and I don't care what you say. It doesn't matter what you owe me the money for. Yeah, if I touch this, he's not afraid of it, the Jew would come and watch him and see what he does."
Yes. So I mean, I'm sure it makes a difference. Again, I think the nuances are extreme, right? Because the question, like you just said very clearly and accurately, right? There are places where they don't care, right? We're assuming that the non-Jew is going to be afraid to touch this because if he's caught, he's going to have to pay. But like you're saying, if it's a situation where he doesn't have to worry and they can railroad the Jews or ignore them or whatever, then yeah, absolutely. We'd be concerned that the non-Jew will touch it. And therefore, any wine left with them might be yain nesach. Yeah, no, I mean, this of course gets into very, very complex questions of kashrut, where we rely on cameras and monitors because we're afraid, people are not going to do it. But if there's no busha and there's no reason people are afraid, obviously it's hard to rely on that. But complicated. The next case in the Mishnah was nafal lebar va'ala, right? The non-Jew fell into the pit and he came out. Amar Rav Papa loshana shalom mate. Says Rav Papa, the only time that the wine would be permitted to sell, right? It's prohibited to drink, but it'd be permitted to sell is if the non-Jew was pulled out of there dead. Because we assume, I guess, that on the way down, he wasn't doing yain nesach, he was trying to swim, and on the way up, he's dead. Aval, Allah chai, if the non-Jew comes up alive, then asur, then you can't even sell the wine. My time, it says Rav Papa, the dami alek, yomei dam, because it's like his holiday, right? He gets saved, he's getting pulled up. On his way up, he's like, "Oh my God, I was rescued." He wants to say gratitude to his God, and he's going to take some of the wine and pour it. I don't know how he's doing this exactly. He's in the vat, but he's pouring some of the wine. He's moving the wine around in honor of his God. And therefore, basically says Rav Papa, if he's alive, it would be prohibited. In the next cases in the Mishnah, we had 4 cases, right, where you used a reed to measure it. You kicked off the bee. You threw it in anger. Says the Mishnah, And the Mishnah said all these cases happened, and they said you can sell the wine. And Rabbi Shimon, sorry, was matir even to drink. Says Rav Ada bar Ava, I think Rabbi Shimon is great. Yanichu lo Rabbi Shimon brachot al rosho. They should shower blessings on the head of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon is clear. Keshu matir, when Rabbi Shimon said it's mutar, you can drink mutar afilu b'shtiya. Keshu oser afilu b'hana'ah. There's no middle ground to Rabbi Shimon. It's not like, oh, it's permitted to get hana'ah, but it's prohibited to drink. It's sort of yain nesach. It's not yain nesach. Rabbi Shimon is a very clear-cut person. If it's prohibited for everything. If it's permitted, it's permitted for everything. Amr b'chia brei da'abba bar nachmin amr Rav Chisda amr Rav. Amr Rav Chisda amr Ziri halachik Rabbi Shimon. That we love Rabbi Shimon. He's clear. He's concise. That's how we paskin. And Ikadamri, some said Amr Rav Chisda, Amr Abba bar Chanan, Hachi Amr Ziri, halachik Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon was a very popular figure among the Amoraim, but says the Gemara, unfortunately, ein halachik Rabbi Shimon. That is not the way we paskin. So despite all these opinions and all this praise for Rabbi Shimon, bottom line is we don't go like Rabbi Shimon. So that is the Gemara's statement.
According to whom?
Right. So the question is who, right? Who?
I mean, you got a lot of rabbis that seem to support him. So who doesn't support him?
So when the Gemara says ein halachik, it's a great question. And it tells you a lot about how the Gemara was organized. The traditions of Ravina and Rav Ashi or Marbar Rav Ashi were the editors ultimately, and this is their final word. Ein halachik Rabbi Shimon, that we don't paskin that way, despite all these people saying we do. And this is the way we go. We go like the last word usually in the Gemara. Of course, it's never so simple, but that is what our Gemara says. Nato chavit v'zarka b'chamato lebar. The final case in the Mishnah was you took a barrel and you're angry about maybe your team lost the World Series, or you're angry at this guy for not selling you good, whatever the reason is. You're in your anger, you threw this barrel into the pit full of wine, zel yamaseh, and they said it was okay, right? They said in the Mishnah that it was hichshiro. Amar Rav Ashi, now it says Rav Ashi, I want to tell you a very interesting principle, right? Thinking of yain nesech, turn your mind to a second to think about a zav. A zav, or a zava, is a person who's tameh because of whatever emission. And zav is tameh in many different ways. And Rashi says this has nothing to do, there's a concept of zav tuma, what's called hesed, or tuma mishkav and moshav, right, where the zav sits on a carriage, everything under the carriage is tameh. That's not what we're talking about here. It's not like if you sit on the carriage and the wine is in the bottom, it's tameh. A zav that touches something is tameh. But a zav, remember we had in a lot of cases a zav who spits on something, the thing becomes tameh. But says the Rav Ashi, the principle is that kol shebezav tameh, anything that if a zav did this, it would become tameh, then an ovei kochavim who does it, oseh yain nesach. Ovei kochavim touches something or pushes it, and a zav who pushed it would become tameh from a zav, it would become yain nesach. But kol shebezav tahor, anything that's tahor by a zav, ovei kochavim eno oseh yain nesach. By Novei Kochavim, it doesn't make yain nesach. And Rashi says he's principally coming to tell you that if you throw something, right, if a zav picked up a ball and threw it and hit a person, that person would not be tameh, because it's not the zav touching them, it's the ball touching them. The same thing would be true by Novei Kochavim. If you picked it up and threw a ball into something, it would not become yain nesach. Ask him, what about our Mishnah? Eitiv Rafun in the Rav Ashi, our Mishnah says, Natala techavit v'zarka b'chamato lebor. You picked up the barrel and you threw it in anger into the pit. But the implication of our Mishnah is that it's only because you were in anger. B'chamato in shlo b'chamato lo. Right? But if you had thrown it not out of anger, it seems that it would be yain nesach. And by a zav, that wouldn't be tameh. So why would a barrel be only permitted if it's in anger? Answers the Gemara, you're right, but hatam, the case of a barrel is a unique case because it's not really thrown. It's ka'azal minei uminei. So Rashi says it's migalgel. It rolls down towards the thing. So since it rolls down towards the thing, it's considered that basically his energy is touching it the whole time that it's rolling down. It's not so clear why. Rashi seems to imply that we're afraid you might touch it again, right? Meaning it's rolling and Dilma Naga, that you're going to touch it as it's going down. And so you're more directly involved in putting this barrel into the pit. And therefore, it's only if you're doing it in anger, where we assume you're not really paying attention and you're not, gonna be thinking about yain nesach, that it'll be permitted by na'ah. But if it wasn't done in anger, we're afraid that you touch the barrel up to the time it went into the pit, and if you directly put it in the pit, it would be prohibited. But in general, if you throw something, that's not prohibited. So it's only an issue with the barrel because it's azam mineh mineh because it rolls down towards the pit. And so that's
So if it's not in anger, then it's
so the concern is that if it's not in anger, Rashi seems to imply to me at least that if it's not in anger, that you're going to touch the barrel right as it's going into the pit, meaning you're going to keep touching it. So it's unlike, although you rolled it
Rashi
down
says if it's not in anger, lo the chashin and dilma naga, that we don't suspect that perhaps he touched it.
No, you have to put the comma somewhere else. I'll read the Rashi to you. Hilkach shelo b'chamato. If you were not in anger, lo, you would not be permitted to drink it. D'chashinan dilma naga, because you worried that maybe you touched it.
Oh, that's where you read it.
Yeah, you got to move the comma. It's complicated.
So
So
maybe it's possible that they were trying to stop it from actually going down.
right, it could be too. Yeah, that you were trying to. That's not what Rashi says, but yeah.
No.
But it's no, it certainly makes sense. So that it's only a case where it's a barrel where it rolls into it, and so it's not exactly the same as throwing it. But in fact, if a non-Jew picked up a baseball and threw it into the vat, it could be that that it would be asur b'hana'ah, but it would certainly be mutar. Sorry, mutar asur b'shtiyah, but it would be mutar b'hana'ah.
So you have to know whether he was angry. Then is that it?
You have to know whether he was angry, and you have to. There's actually a Rashi tomorrow who summarizes a lot of this. Where's the Rashi? Somewhere tomorrow. If you look tomorrow, it's very interesting. I don't actually know who wrote this Rashi, but if you turn the page to Samachalach and Bet, below the end of Hadron Lech Rabbi Yishmael, right, there's a whole section on the bottom there, which is Rashi. We think it's Rashi. I don't actually know if someone knows it's really Rashi, where he says Maskana de Milta, right? This is the sum. This is the final line. And he summarizes all of these details about, if the non-Jew did it with anger, if the non-Jew did it this way, if he touched it, if he didn't. He goes through a lot of the details and gives a summary, which is very unusual for Rashi, right? We don't usually have this in Rashi. And I think, I'm not sure, there's some opinions that maybe it's not Rashi, but anyways, this is very, very nuanced and complicated about what the non-Jew is intending, what he was doing at the same time. Was he angry, as we said? Was he drowning? Was he not? And how does that impact it? Very, very interestingly, there are those who discuss, remember we had the case before where the non-Jew fell into it and came out alive. We said if he came out alive, it would be a problem because he's worshiping his God because he's saved, right? So the question that a lot of Rishonim ask is, why do you need to come on to the fact that he's making it a holiday? The reality is, if he's alive, he's moving things around. And kishkush, we said, is usher, right? So what do you mean he's grateful? Just say the fact that he's moving things around makes it usher. And so there's a whole discussion about whether that means that if he is just swimming, right, it's not a problem. It's only because there's a religious connotation to him, it becomes a problem. And again, another nuance in terms of when is pouring wine prohibited and when is it not? Is it only if it's derech nisuch bekach, in front of the Avodah Zarah, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all discussions. They are very practical. Halacha, certainly for Rashi, who had lived in a wine producing area. But we have one more daf for this parak, and then you'll see Rashi's summary. Yasher koach.
Did you already finish the entire Masechta?
I have learned this before in my life, but it's been a while.
No, I don't know. I mean, it seems that you know the whole rest of the Masechta. I'm just curious.
It's one page ahead. I didn't go that far.
No, you mentioned, you did say that you said we're going to learn something a few weeks from now.
Oh, Rashi always forecasts. I mean, I know that, but Rashi talks about the Mishnah later about washing out the vats. Yeah.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, Rashi references that. We're going to discuss it later.
No, I mean, you may have.
Don't worry. I get Rashi to help me. Don't worry.
No, but you said that we were going to learn in a few weeks. That maybe you finished the whole Masechta already.
Right. Okay. Yashkoch, everyone.
Thank you. Shavua tov.
Shavua tov. We'll see you next week.